Please go for it!
Please search for it! Please search for it! Please search for it!
The level of perpetual anxiety that we have to exist with is just an unfair burden, and we have to stop it.
The laws, he says, place Nevada in the forefront of justice reform. Senate Bill 50 would limit no-knock warrants to the rarest of circumstances. The law is in response to the case of Bianca Taylors, who was killed when such a warrant was executed last year in Louisville.
Hi, and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Nicole Dungca, an investigative reporter at The Washington Post. Together with my colleague Jen Abelson, I am a co-host of a new podcast called Broken Doors. It's a 6-part series investigating no-knock warrants and how they're deployed in the American justice system, and what happens when accountability is flawed on every level. We'll hope you check it out, but today we're talking about no-knock warrants, and we are welcoming Nevada Attorney General Aaron Ford to the program. We're going to talk about the use of no-knock warrants across the country and his efforts to restrict them within his home state. Thank you so much for joining us, Attorney General Ford.
Thank you for having me, Nicole.
So no-knock warrants have been back in the spotlight because of the Amir Locke shooting in Minnesota. Can we start with the basics here, Attorney General? Can you tell us about no-knock warrants and what they mean and how they compare to regular search warrants?
Absolutely. First off, let me say thank you again, Nicole, for this important conversation, and thank you for including me. No-knock warrants, as you've indicated at the beginning of your podcast here, have a history dating back a few decades. And most folks are familiar with the typical warrant called knock and announce, where police officers will come to a door, knock them, and announce themselves as officers and ask for entry or for conversation. No-knock warrants are those you see on television and oftentimes on the news now, where law enforcement busts down a door without announcing themselves first. And as you might imagine, that leads to potentially a lot of trepidation inside at home. Not knowing who it is that's breaking down your door could lead to danger on both sides, whether it's a civilian or whether it's a law enforcement officer. And so, here in Nevada, when I presented this bill that you've already referenced, we acknowledged the fact that law enforcement in our state rarely used no-knock warrants. But what we wanted to do was to be both reactive to the Bianca Taylors killing, but preventive as well, proactive in the sense that we wanted to codify what was good practice within police departments and make it part of law in our state. And as you've indicated, the Amir Locke circumstance in Minnesota, and frankly, one here in our own state with Isaiah Williams has put no-knock warrants back into the forefront.
Yeah, we actually spoke with you over the course of our reporting for the podcast, and we really thank you for your outlook. I mean, can you talk a little bit about the specifics of the bill and why you thought it was so necessary?
Absolutely. So, again, after the murder of George Floyd last year, to be sure, this was high on alert. In addition to the killing of Bianca Taylors, police reform was high on alert in conversation here in our state. The Bianca Taylors killing in particular, it touched us dramatically because, again, it was the wrongful execution of a no-knock warrant. And so what I wanted to do was to ensure that we could address issues that we were hearing in the community around this issue. And so we presented legislation that had parties from all sides of the issues, public defenders and prosecutors, law enforcement, the ACLU, community organizations, rank and file citizens, so to speak, in the room together, working through legislation and bills to try to come up with a solution to improve relationships between law enforcement and the communities that we serve, particularly in the no-knock context. And I have to give specific credit to Assembly Speaker Jason Frierson and Senate Majority Leader Nicole Cannizzaro, who were receptive and supportive of these efforts, including several Republicans on the other side of the aisle. For example, Assemblyman Tom Roberts and Senator Ben Kekepper, who also reached out in order to be part of these conversations. So we were able to pass a law relative to no-knock warrants that passed, and I will say unanimously, which is very difficult to do in this day and age, as you know, that does put grave restrictions on the use of no-knock warrants. It does not ban the use here in our state, but it does put great restrictions on it, and happy to discuss what some of those restrictions are and what some of those parameters were.
Yeah, I'd love to talk more specifically about what those restrictions actually are. But I also want to go a little bit back when you talked about Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. You mentioned it while signing the bill. You mentioned it here. I mean, can you talk a little bit about how this issue resonates with you on a personal level? Why you found yourself so compelled to really look into this?
Absolutely. Listen, I've said it a few times, and it's if it's not obvious, I'm a black man. I'm a black man. I'm married to a black woman, raising 3 black sons and a black nephew. And so when we see instances of Black Americans being wrongly killed at the hands of law enforcement, it hits home. It resonates with us, and it's something that gives me a great trepidation, a word that I used earlier, and it's something that again has us to live in what I call perpetual anxiety. And it's an unfair burden, as I've said before, and it's one that we continue to carry, but one that I'm confident that we can continue to relieve ourselves of through efforts like this, where the community comes together with law enforcement to work through issues like this that address concerns. And again, personally, in my own home, we have those concerns with three black sons and a black nephew. I'll, as an aside, just tell you after Ahmaud Arbery was killed by vigilantes in Georgia, my wife got upset with me because I had sent my son out, my then, I think it was 14-year-old son out to take the trash out. It was past dusk, and she was concerned. She said, "Don't send my child out past dusk because I don't want what happened to Ahmaud Arbery to happen to him." And these are the types of conversations we have in our home because of, again, the actual anxiety that exists when we see these types of things happen to our community.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's a really important perspective that a lot of people need to hear. And to kind of go back to the bill, you were saying that it doesn't outright ban no-knocks. I mean, when you were working on this, were you encountering any pushback from some sectors? Were people saying don't do an outright ban? Like, what is law enforcement's general view when you talk about restricting or banning no-knock warrants?
Well, let me offer you 2 responses to that. The first of which is to say that I have to give law enforcement credit where it's due. I didn't get much pushback from law enforcement at all around this conversation. I think they understood the content and the context of what we were dealing with at the time, and so we hand in hand with community groups to ensure that we found a responsible piece of legislation to address no-knock warrants. I did get questions around, and I did acknowledge at the outset of my testimony in the legislature as to why I did not seek an outright ban. And frankly, it's because I recognize that I'm not all prescient. I'm not omnipotent. We don't know of every circumstance in which a no-knock warrant could exist. And there may be one circumstance where it actually saves a civilian's life or protects a law enforcement officer. And so what I wanted to do was, instead of banning it outright, was to recognize that there may be a one-off circumstance where it was more appropriate, but to put grave restrictions around its use to minimize the opportunity for us to have misuse of no-knock warrants and see the negative ramifications of their use.
And so what are some of those uses that are still allowed under this bill?
Well, let me tell you what's not allowed, first off, and that's we've restricted the use of no-knock warrants. You cannot use it in a misdemeanor crime. You can't use it in a property crime. You can't use it in a simple drug possession crime. In my estimation, they simply do not rise to the standard of danger that's required for the use of this procedure. And so under the restrictions, law enforcement agencies who wish to use no-knock warrants must first prove that there is a significant and immediate threat to public safety that justifies the use. And another consideration is officer and civilian safety. Would using a standard a standard knock and announce warrant compromise the safety of officers or civilians? And so in drafting the requirements for the no-knock warrant, I consulted with law enforcement, including my own chief of investigations, who spent 29 years in the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department to come up with, again, ways in which we can put parameters around no-knock warrants for use in felony circumstances that are of the gravest type of circumstance.
Thank you. And in our reporting, we found it was very difficult to get data on no-knock warrants and how often they're used. And we couldn't get many law enforcement leaders to talk about the use of no-knocks within their own departments. And before I get to this next question, I'd love to play a little bit of the podcast to give you an idea of what we were reporting on. In this clip, my co-host Jen Abelson is talking to Sheriff Cecil Cantrell from Monroe County, Mississippi.
Sheriff Cantrell was shaking his head and starting to look agitated. I'd been asking him about no-knock warrants for several minutes.
And you have no, idea of how often they were used or sort of how frequently?
I couldn't answer that and give you an honest answer.
Okay, that's fine. I appreciate you saying that. So did you, I guess I was curious too,
Can I say that?
No, these are my questions.
We were sitting about 2 feet away, and then the sheriff reached his arm out and made an actual grab for the notes in my lap.
She'll ask them soon. I promise I'll get through them. I want to know.
You know what you're doing? You're interrogating me.
Oh, I don't think so. I'm trying to have an interview. You want to ask me some questions? You can. I
want to see that paper.
Oh, this is my work. I can't give you my work.
So in that clip, you do see a little reluctance from some officials to talk about how often they're used, how frequently they're used, what kind of data is available for it. You talked a little bit about Nevada saying they weren't used that often. Can you talk about how you see it being used nationwide? Do you have an idea about how often it's being used nationwide?
Well, I can offer nationwide examples. I can offer a recitation of public information. Right, in 2017, we know that the New York Times conducted an investigation and reported that, and I'll quote, at least 81 civilians and 13 law enforcement officers died in no-knock warrant raids between 2010 and 2016. We also know that here in our own state, again, that they were limited. And we have one of our large law enforcement agencies in our state that has said that they generally prohibit no-knock warrants except for a deliberate hostage rescue caused by immediate life rescue exigency. So, while again at the national level, I probably couldn't offer you statistics that are more current than recent studies. But I can say here in our state, we are working toward ensuring that they are minimally used, and that when they are used appropriately.
And we're actually looking into that with a story that we'll have out on Friday. So I hope everyone will go see that. The New York Times piece actually includes a lot of knock and announce warrants in that as well, but is generally looking at SWAT team raids. So that's a very important piece of reporting that really has been eye-opening for a lot of people on this kind of issue. And in general, no-knock warrants are only supposed to be used in cases when, as you were saying, an officer might get hurt, or sometimes where evidence might get destroyed. These are generally the cases where they're being used. We looked into judicial scrutiny and how there seems to be little training on this, and how sometimes, judges were routinely issuing. No, it's fine. That's how it goes with a live event. And so we often saw how judges might have been routinely issuing these kinds of warrants. Do you have any thoughts on the issue of judicial scrutiny and their role in kind of making sure that these are being used only in kind of really dire circumstances?
Yeah, you raise a great point, and it's something that we talked about in the context of drafting legislation that passed unanimously. And it begins with well, maybe it doesn't begin with, but certainly encompasses the affidavit requirement that an officer must comply with when seeking a no-knock warrant. And so under our legislation now, the affidavit must show probable cause that establishes that the charged crime is a felony, and that the facts in the case show that there's a real risk to public safety. Again, it's not just the law enforcement officers' public safety issue that we're concerned about. We're concerned about the general public safety as well. The affidavit has to explain why a knock and announce warrant won't suffice. Why wouldn't it work? It also affords the judge the ability to issue on its own volition a summons as opposed to a warrant for arrest. The application for a warrant has to specify whether it can be executed during daylight hours. That's important, between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. And if not, why not? The affidavit has to describe the investigation to date in detail and explain what evidence uncovered what uncovered evidence indicates that a no-knock warrant is necessary. The affiant must certify to the court that nothing less than a no-knock warrant could be sufficient. And then the affiant must certify that the officers who are actually effecting the no-knock warrant are properly trained to do so. So there are obviously interactions with the judicial system that we have implemented, that we have placed into this legislation that allows us to hopefully hopefully implement no-knock warrants safely.
Thank you so much. No, it's great to really hear the specifics of that bill. I also wanted to zoom out a little bit. I mean, you've talked a little bit about this, but from what you know about policing, I mean, do you have a sense of the kind of communities that are most often, bearing the brunt of these kinds of raids? Like, what communities are seeing these kinds of raids the most?
Well, listen, it would be pure speculation on my part to argue what used to be, because as I've indicated, in Nevada, no-knock warrants were very seldomly used. And that was part of the testimony that I was able to share with the legislature when I passed this legislation. It was an acknowledgement, again, that our local law enforcement had done a generally good job of limiting the use of no-knock warrants. So that's my response in that regard. We, regardless of the community in which it's used, however, we want to be certain that, again, when they are used, that it is an appropriate use, that it is a use that is pursuant to the law.
And in those cases that they were used, I mean, what was your impression about when they were typically used? What was it looking like on the ground and in practice?
Well, again, the last no-knock warrant, it hasn't been used frequently enough for us to even talk about, more general responses in that regard, or specific responses on that type of question there. What I do note, again, is that the recent use was to effect an arrest on a suspect in the wee hours of the morning. And it's something that, again, we're going to have to be looking at to ensure that the law was followed and that all precautions were properly taken. Again, I'm not in a position to be able to dictate or to detail which communities were those in the past that were targeted, so to speak, for the use of no-knock warrants.
Yeah, so in our reporting, we did see that there were a lot of cases in which these were used for narcotic searches. There were certain departments or certain squads that were really using these pretty routinely, and some judges who were routinely issuing them for narcotic searches. And I think that's a pattern and practice that we've seen kind of nationwide. I think it also speaks a little bit to what you were talking about with the bill. I mean, do you think that these should be used in these cases? Usually when they're looking for drugs, they're looking for narcotics?
Well, we put in, again, a restriction on the use, and it can't be a misdemeanor crime. It can be a property crime, and it can be a simple drug possession crime. We're talking about felony crimes that rise to the level to a standard of danger that presents a significant and immediate threat to public safety. And that's a case-by-case analysis, to be sure, which is one of the reasons why, again, the affidavit requirement is so important. And so a judge will have to be persuaded by an affidavit in a circumstance, whether it involves drugs or whether it involves a kidnapping or whether it involves another particular crime. It's a case-specific inquiry that the affidavit is going to have to detail, and we'll leave it to the judicial branch to be able to make that determination.
And after the Amir Locke case, there were renewed calls to restrict or ban no-knock warrants on the federal level. What do you think about those bans on the federal level? Do you think that's something that is likely to pass or actually be enacted?
Well, obviously, no one can predict what's going to happen at the federal level. I'll note that last September, the Department of Justice did announce restrictions on federal agents' use of no-knock warrants, and then the much more narrow than what is allowed by law. And under the new restrictions, no-knock warrants are generally limited to situations where an agent has a reasonable ground to believe that knocking and announcing the agent's presence would create an imminent threat of physical violence to the agent or to another person. And I think that that's something to consider or to keep in mind. And President Biden himself has also said that he's looking at limiting other federal agents' use of the tactic after the killing of Amir Locke in Minnesota this past February. But one of the biggest proposed changes to no-knock warrants nationwide, as you know, I'm certain, is in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which would bar these warrants in federal drug investigations and provide incentives for states to do the same. I've been very clear in my support for the bill, and I've joined, in fact, a coalition of several other colleagues of mine, attorneys general across the nation from other states, to urge Congress to take action on this. But again, predicting what Congress would do is something that's beyond the purview of all of us. I'm certain you understand.
I am not a mind reader. That is correct. But speaking of Amir Locke, there was big news on that front last week when prosecutors declined to file charges against the officer who shot and killed him. What did you think of that decision?
Well, that was in Minnesota with my good friend Keith Ellison, who I believe has already demonstrated his penchant for justice. We have to be able to develop a trust or redevelop a trust in the in our criminal justice system. I trust Keith Ellison in his analysis. Obviously, it's a tragic circumstance with Mr. Locke's killing, but I do trust the investigation that General Ellison undertook and the determination that he arrived at. Pardon me.
Yeah, and in that case, it obviously involved a victim who had a gun. I mean, what do you think of how Americans' culture around guns, how many guns are in America, how does that dynamic play into no-knock warrants and the dangers that officers may face if they do force their way into doors where people may not know they're police?
Well, certainly it plays a huge dynamic in it. And frankly, it's beyond no-knock warrants. We all know that the prevalence of guns in our society causes concerns for law enforcement, and which is one of the reasons why many in law enforcement agree with common sense gun safety measures that legislatures and the Congress has attempted to pass. I do think that the issue is compounded when you are talking about no-knock warrants and the execution of those, because those who are those who are lawfully owning firearms may very well resort to use their firearm when someone bursts into their home unannounced. It's an expected response, and it's something that we should keep in mind as we continue talking around these issues.
Right, and I think I've heard from law enforcement officers who defend these warrants, they say that they need that element of surprise. And like we were just talking about, there have been cases where police officers have been hurt during these no-knock warrants. We've found some cases where police officers have been killed during no-knock warrants, where the person within the home says they didn't know that it was an officer when they shot, when they were firing their gun. I mean, can you talk a little bit about this idea that these warrants do keep officers safer when you're thinking about law enforcement officers who offer that defense of these?
Well, let me say this about our legislation. I mean, we acknowledge that particular concern, especially on the execution of no-knock warrants, which is why we have said that if they are to be used, we've established a rule around the implementation that says that once the no-knock warrant has been executed, you have to immediately announce your presence, because then the element of surprise is gone, at least to try to get information to whomever is in the home that it's law enforcement that is bursting into the home as opposed to an intruder. That can help reduce misidentification, which can also help reduce tragic events of law enforcement being shot, but also individuals who are innocent or not the target of a no-knock warrant likewise avoid being harmed. It is a very real issue, and it is a very real concern, which is, again, the reason why in our state, no-knock warrants are very seldomly used. It is a dangerous circumstance that should only be reserved and preserved for the most heinous of circumstances, terrorism, for example, or trying to, rescue a hostage under circumstances that would require a no-knock warrant. So those are my thoughts on that. There's no reason for us to doubt the seriousness of this issue, and we need to be cognizant of the fact that safety needs to be at the forefront.
Mhm. And before I get to one of my final questions, I'd like to play this clip from Bianca Taylor's mother, Tamika Palmer. I think that we've mentioned Bianca Taylor's name a lot with this issue throughout this entire conversation, so it would be great to hear from her. We did talk to her for this podcast, and we'll be featuring her conversation.
I cannot believe everything that's happened in the last few years, that there are police officers still choosing to behave in that manner. I can't believe that people are still doing this thing, and here we are coming up on March the 13th again, and no one's been held accountable for what happened to Brianna. And to have to stomach this day all over again is insane to me. I've said this 100 times, it's still March the 13th to me.
Right, and it was a very tough interview to have. I mean, what is the legacy of Bianca Taylor's death on no-knock warrants? What do you think the landscape of no-knock warrants will look like in 5 years, 10 years, when you think about how this death has really affected how people think of these kinds of warrants?
Well, that was a difficult interview to hear, and my heart continues to go out to her mother. Can't imagine. I got bad goosebumps right now hearing that. And part of her legacy, to use your phraseology, is the legislation that I passed. It was in her name that I passed this in an effort to cut down on those types of results. We need to keep in mind that tragedies like this will continue to occur unless we put restrictions on the use of no-knock warrants and ensure that there are safeguards around their use to the extent they will be allowed to be used. Again, which is the reason why I have said in our legislation, and we passed in our legislation, the requirement that law enforcement immediately announce themselves once they're in the building. Our legislation also requires body cameras to be worn whenever practicable, so that they can see, so that we can look back on what happened. And that we also require that law enforcement, even before they execute a no-knock warrant, even if they have their permission, they have to do a last-minute assessment, analysis, to determine whether the need for a no-knock warrant is still present. And if circumstances at any given moment create a risk to innocent people that was not previously ascertained or present, then they should consider that before executing a no-knock warrant. I think those are some of the legacies, trying to find ways to limit the use, and in other states to eliminate the use of no-knock warrants, because what we saw in Bianca Taylor's killing was something that was clearly a travesty and a tragedy.
And I actually do have one other question, if that's okay. But there are some advocates who say that just outright banning or restricting no-knock warrants is one step, but there should be even more done to kind of restrict regular knock-and-announce warrants, to make sure that there are even more restrictions about making sure that law enforcement officers wait longer at the door, or that they can't use evidence in certain cases if they're violating some of these different rules for forced entries. I mean, what do you think of those thoughts that there should be even more restrictions with regular search warrants to help cut down on these kinds of dangerous raids?
Well, you talk about the evidentiary issue. Let me, before I get to your question about regular knock and announce, indicate that in our legislation, we also have repercussions for evidentiary issues. If, for example, the affiant lies, then the phrase you've heard on TV, poisonous tree, fruit of the poisonous tree, that doctrine kicks in and any evidence can't be utilized. And so we have restrictions, we have repercussions in our law to address that. Now, to your question about additional restrictions on regular knock and announce warrants, I'm not in a position to be able to opine on particular suggestions in that regard, but what I would do is what I've always done, which is to the extent those conversations come up, I will get people at the table. I will have law enforcement, I will have the ACLU, I will have the public defenders, I will have community groups, and we will sit together and talk about what makes sense in the context conform our legislation to different expectations. And so, that's my response to your query there. And that's something that I would suggest that everyone do, that you listen and that you have that you communicate with those who are affected by these issues and try to come up with a solution that will help address and accommodate some of the concerns.
Yeah, I think we'll really have to keep our eye on that because I feel like this issue is going to keep being in the spotlight as we've seen. But I think we're out of time right now. And Attorney General Ford, thank you so much for sharing all your insights. I felt like they were so important to hear kind of the broader picture and, some of these very nitty-gritty specifics. So I really appreciate you joining us here on Washington Post Live.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
And thank you to all of you today for tuning in. Again, I'm Nicole Dungca, and please go to Washington Post Live to see our future programming. It's at washingtonpostlive.com. You can register for new programs. I hope you'll tune in to other programs that we have here and also take a listen to our podcast, Broken Doors. It's out right now, and we will be releasing more episodes this month. So thank you so much.